Hey, Owen, how you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time out with me today.
Yeah, anytime. I'm a Minnesota guy.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know if you've been through Mankato at all over the years, but a lot of stuff has changed over the years here for sure.
Oh, I bet. I think in my band we used to play the k-tel ballroom, I think it was.
Sure.
That existed for so long, and we would run down there and play. Then there used to be our lead singer eventually went down and worked at a radio station in Mankato area. I know that. I'm trying to think of what year that would have been. Probably the early 70s or something like that. So, and I kind of like Mankato. It's kind of a great place. So, spent a lot of time there. So, what is the population of that town right now?
I think right around 100,000, if I believe, are all the surrounding areas.
Wow, so it's grown quite a bit since the days that I was down there. We used to play through there quite regularly at that place. There used to be a place called, I know it was in that area, it was called Jewett's Point Ballroom, which was in that area as well. And that's long gone. That's ancient history, actually. So, but very fond memories of touring in that area, being around that area, and I love Minnesota in general anyway. The older I got, the less of a fan I became of the winters, but that said, it was a great place to live and work and bring up children, and I still go back, not often, but maybe once every couple of years now, back to the Twin Cities area.
Awesome. Well, yeah, the k-tel Ballroom is still in existence, and early 70s. It's very possible that this might have been the radio station he worked for.
It is possible, I guess, huh? We both went to radio broadcaster school, the lead singer of my band and myself, and I got shipped off to Wisconsin to work the graveyard shift someplace in Wisconsin from midnight till 4 a.m. or something. I think I cried and came home after about a month. But he went down to Mankato. He had a good time down there. I went back into the music business after my band broke up. So kind of an interesting story down there. So did you get a chance to get through the book at all? And
yeah, I've checked out the book, and you mentioned getting back into the music business. I wanted to talk to you, of course, about your book, Famous People Who've Met Me. It does kind of have a special extra something for longtime Minnesota residents, I think.
Yes, because everything that I did revolved really around being a Minnesota guy, and either being in a band in 1902 and having a little bit of a hit record and touring around that area, and a lot around the Midwest. And then, of course, I had several companies that were born in the Twin Cities: an advertising agency, a management company, a recording studio. And, of course, I grew up in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, which is just a suburb of Minneapolis. And so everything that really in that book just really emanates from Minnesota, from St. Louis Park, from Minneapolis, from all the places we toured around in the state. And so my ties are very strong and very deep with Minnesota. And then, of course, my association with Prince and the other acts that I signed coming out of that town. So I'm very fond of the area. And it's just two things happened. My business sort of gravitated out here in the 90s to Los Angeles, where I live now. And to tell you the truth, I'm more of a sailor than a skier. So to be honest with you, I was living, before I got remarried again, I was living at the ocean, and I was the Commodore of the yacht club out there, still in the music business, but I was doing my love of sailing on the ocean. I lived on Lake Minnetonka, and I had sailboats on Lake Minnetonka up there. So all of that is very close to me, but the winters kind of got to me, and then of course my business moved out here. Once I stopped managing. Also, I was in the '90s. I worked. I was the chief op. The first time I ever worked for anyone else. Of course, I'm not a good employee. I found that out. But I worked for two major corporations in the '90s. One of those was k-tel Records, the famous late night compilation company, music company. And then I was hired away to be senior vice president at a place called Musicland San Goody, which was the largest record chain in America. And at the time, they're non-existent anymore. But they were the largest record store chain in America, and I was senior vice president there. But I went back into my own business after probably 6 or 7 years of being employed by others, and just went back into working with the estates of artists who had died but had left the heirs all of their of their assets, and I would help to manage the assets and sell the assets if the family wanted to do that to larger record labels. And it's a very interesting subject matter, because I came over some of the biggest hit records in time that I grew up with, and now I'm selling these records and managing them, and it's pretty interesting. But as far as where it all started, it literally all started in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, where if you read the book, I was kind of the nerd guy in junior high and high school, and was beat up by the school jocks and all of that, but forming a band and getting into a band probably saved my life at that time, because by 11th grade, I remember I started to put together the band, and by 12th grade, I believe we were playing at the school events, and the jocks couldn't beat up the school nerd anymore. I waved my nerd flag very high, but because I think it really helped formulate what I was going to be later on, and I managed to get in touch with who I really was at that point, and through music. And through playing in a band at my high school in St. Louis Park. And it was great, actually, because all the high school girls who were dating the jocks, once we got in and our band was so bad, meaning good bad, that, they kind of left the jocks behind for the band members. So that was a real turnaround for me. But more so, the band got me into the business, and really taught me how to be a manager. We had a manager, but as the band became bigger, I noticed that we were being paid less. And it was like, well, how can that be? Because I know we were getting more money. And I don't know, I'm not going to make any insinuations, but I wound up letting the manager of our band go, and I took over management of the band. And then I could get on the phone and call our booking agent and get better gigs and higher paying gigs and all of that. So it was all life lessons back then.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating book. Obviously, kind of subtitled "A Memoir of the Man Who Discovered Prince," but all the stories outside of that, with Jimi Hendrix and Elvis and your band and Howdy Doody and all that stuff. Definitely worth another book for sure.
It's interesting, and one of the primary reasons that I wrote that book was because a lot of people felt that my life began and ended with the artist Prince, and that when we parted ways, it was over, and, I was kind of sitting in a room alone before I met him, but that's not the truth. And really the point of the book was to show all of the events in my life, my first discovery of being passionate about music pretty young, but all of the events in the business that I got into were all kind of my education and my college, if you may, to teach me what to happen when that one day Prince came over to my house in 1976 and we met each other. So everything had been a learning experience, because after the band broke up, to tell you the truth, after our band broke up, we were totally broke. It was the 60s, okay? That's all I need to say.
Okay.
And we had spent our money on all kinds of things we shouldn't have, but cars and dating and all, we were going to be big rock stars for the rest of our lives, or let me put it this way, junior rock stars, because our record had gone top 10 in 19 cities around the United States. But one day it was all over, and I called our booking agent to see about getting more dates, and he said, well, we don't have any more of those bigger dates down in Kansas City or whatever, but I do have a week at the bar of the Holiday Inn in Duluth, Minnesota. And I'm out of there. I'm not going to do that. So the band kind of broke up, and then it was like we looked at each other and it was like, whoa, wait a minute, we don't have any money. We spent it all. That was one of my first real catalytic moments into realizing that there's two words to show business, show and business, and you better be able to have both of those under your belt or you're going to lose. So at one point, we were broke. I couldn't go to McDonald's and get a job because, hey, in my mind, I was a rock star, and I could not picture myself wearing a hat saying, do you want to supersize that or whatever, So we actually wound up working, the lead singer and I actually wound up working in a basement phone room selling aluminum siding. We did this for about 3 months. And because we didn't want anybody to see us. And then I got the idea one day to call my booking agent, the one that had booked our band, who I had known. And the first thing he said to me, well, what makes you think that a hippie musician like you could be a booking agent and, get bookings and do all this kind of stuff? And I just gave him one answer. I said, because I kind of watched the way you screwed everybody over, and I made notes of it, and I understood. And then he said to me, okay, you got the job. So I became a booking agent, booking local bands into venues in places like the k-tel Ballroom, and I forgot where we used to play in Austin, Minnesota at the time. And, so I was familiar with the venues. I was familiar with the business. And I just made a decision to become a booking agent. But then I learned that lying was a really good way to create business. In fact, I teach at UCLA now. I teach the business of music at UCLA. It's just one of my areas to give back. And the first day of class, I say to my students, I'm going to teach you how to lie. And they were like, whoa, wait a minute. You can't do that. That's not proper. I said, no, there's a proper way to lie to create business, for yourself where no one gets hurt. And, a bad lie is, talking to your friend and saying, hey, dude, I saw your girlfriend with some other guy down at the club last week, and they looked like they were way too friendly. That's a hurtful lie if you're going to tell something like that. But what happened was I'm working as a booking agent, and a national promoter, was going to bring Steppenwolf into the Twin Cities. And Steppenwolf at that time wanted their opening bands to be local bands from the area. I don't think they were being kind. I think they just didn't want any competition from other bands on the way up. Sure. So pick a local band, have them play, and then they can come out and be the big heroes, which is actually, not a bad idea. But they called me as the local booking agent, and I'm on the phone with this promoter, and he says, I'm bringing Steppenwolf into the Twin Cities. This would have been the early 70s, very early 70s. And we need a local band to go on. And I said, fine, I can recommend at least 3 bands I know that would be perfect as an opening artist for you. And I said, and by the way, when the acts come in town, like Steppenwolf and everything, who does their food backstage, and who does their security, and who lines up the limousines in the hotels for you? And the promoter was like, do you do that? I said, oh, yeah, we have a separate service where we do security and food and limousines and hotels, and we make it so easy for your acts when they come in town. He said, then I'm hiring you. Well, of course, I had never done that in my life. I was totally lying about this. And I remember he said, you got it. We worked out a price. And it was great. It was extra money for us on top. And I ran into my boss. I hung up and I ran into my boss. He says, "You look like you've seen a ghost." He said, "What happened?" I said, "Well, I just lied my way into doing all of this, and I've never done it in my life." So he looked at me and he said, "Well, then you did it. You better get it done." So I have a second saying, and that is, if you're going to overpromise, you better overdeliver. So I immediately got everything together. And I know that in our office building we were at, the doorman had started a limousine service and bought a couple of cars that they were just going to drive people to the airport and do stuff like that. And I ran downstairs and I said, "Hey, do you want to take this group around when they come in town?" He was like, "Yeah." Then I called, I can't remember the name of them, but they were doing security for sporting events. And I got on the phone with them, and I said, "I got a gig for you for your security force." Eventually, I put together my own security. I said, "But I've got a gig for you. You just got to cut me in for a little bit of the money." Fine, we did that. Then I called a couple of women that I knew back in the day, and I said, "Hey, I need you to go shopping for food with me and get the food, and you can prepare it, but I will be the guy putting the food together in the dressing room for the artists." So I got it together. I overpromised. I actually lied to get my way into the business, but then I overdelivered. So no one ever knew the difference. And meanwhile, the whole thing was to put me in the dressing room. I'm folding bologna and putting out fruit bowls and, chips and stuff in the dressing room. But while I'm doing that, I'm privy to all of the conversations that are going on between the artists and their managers as they came into town. So it was then Steppenwolf, then it was Janis Joplin. Three Dog Night back in the day. And I was the go-to guy suddenly in Minneapolis when you brought your concert in to do all the coordination. But really, it was to be able to be in that dressing room with those artists and hear the conversations. And that's where I learned a lot about the business. Because it was either, "Oh, where did we go wrong? We thought we had a number one record," and I'm playing dumb in there. They don't know who I am. I'm playing dumb. Or, "Hey, this whole thing took off. Wasn't it great that we did this marketing campaign?" So that was my college. And it really was part of the basis of me knowing exactly what to do once Prince came into my life. After that, I sort of became the promoter myself. And I opened up a great place. It was an old Art Deco ballroom downtown Minneapolis called the Marigold Ballroom. No longer there. I think there's a Hyatt Hotel there now. And then I actually became a promoter and brought in the first two sold-out shows for Bonnie Raitt. I don't know how many people know that Bonnie Raitt did her first album in Minnesota, out on Lake Minnetonka. And I brought her in town. We had two sold-out shows, only about 900-seat place, if that. And I did Billy Joel's first sold-out shows in Minneapolis at the club, and a lot of people came. Bob Dylan would stop down at the club. So then I went to my next phase, which was then learning about being a concert promoter and being able to know all that kind of stuff. So everything that I was doing along the way was my education for leading up to the time that a fellow by the name of Chris Moon brought me a demo tape of this artist. And, I always had my answers prepared because I was kind of the quote-unquote music guy in town at that point. And I had my answers prepared, like the parent of some artist would show up with some demo tape, or the artist themselves or the local manager of some act would come in. And my answer was always the same, which was, this is very, very promising. Why don't you come back in 8 or 9 years? Was the way to get them out of my office. Or if it was really bad, I would say, I'll be honest with you. I've just got to be honest with you. This is a hobby. It's not a career for you. And, blatant honesty is the best, because otherwise people will keep calling you over and over again. But when Chris Moon, and by the way, a lot of the music I was hearing was very derivative as well. I was managing another act called Muskie and Rats out of the Twin Cities, and we were close to getting them a record deal. And I managed Kevin Odegaard. They're all acts that I chose, to manage. And also a lot of acts that would come to me to help get them a record deal, they were very derivative of the songs of the day. For instance, a band would come in and they sounded just like Earth, Wind, and Fire. And I would say, well, we already have one Earth, Wind, and Fire. I think we don't need two of them. So I think what you should probably do is either take another course in your musical direction or figure out how to come up with your own sound. But the interesting thing is that when Chris Moon brought a tape down to my company, it was the demo tape that he had done with Prince on a little 8-track machine at his studio. Right off the bat, when he played the tape, I was all ready for my stock answer, and then I start listening to this demo, and it's obvious that whatever band was on the tape was trying to go for something new. And that's what struck me. Now, the recording, albeit was not, it was an 8-track. They did the best they could on a small machine. And the songs were too long and stretched out. But they were trying, whoever it was, I didn't know it was one person at the time. I thought it was a band. And whoever it was attempting to go for something new. I don't know if it was the combination of, keyboard parts kind of doing horn lines against guitar and whatever. But I could hear the influences, but it was not derivative. And I just turned and I said to Chris, who's the band? This is, okay, you got my attention. This is, who's the band? And he said, well, it's not a band. And I said, oh, damn, come on. Is it a bunch of studio musicians? Because they don't tour and it's, they don't want to leave home and you really can't work with them. He said, no. I said, well, then who is it? He said, well, it's one person and he just turned 18 years of age and he's playing everything, all the instruments and singing all the vocals. And the only thing I could think of to say at the time was, well, what's his name? And Chris says, Prince Nelson. And I said, wait, you're telling me there's a one-man Stevie Wonder type of band, or one-man Stevie Wonder kind of person, and his name is, he's the prince of some country? Where does this fairy tale end? And he was like, no, it's his real name. His name is Prince Nelson. He lives over North Minneapolis in Andre Simone's house. He lives in the basement. He left his home. And the first thing I could think of was I got to get this kid on the phone to talk to him because it was very unusual. It wasn't obvious that there were like massive hit records in what I heard on the demo, but I knew there would be because I could tell what they were attempting to do. And I think that Chris and Prince had actually written the first song on the demo that I heard, and that was a song called Soft and Wet, which then made it onto the first album, For You. So Prince was in New York living with his sister at the time, and I told Chris to call him right from my office right then and there on the spot. Chris called him. We spoke for a while. And then Prince, he didn't want to meet me at my office. He was living in New York with his sister, and I think they were trying to get a record deal. They were astounded that nobody was biting on it. I knew why. But when Prince agreed to meet with me, he said, I don't want to come to your office. I want to come to your house, which was kind of cool. So a few weeks later, there's Prince, and he's at my house walking in the door. And I had never met him before, and I said this in the book, too. I wrote this in the book, that it was like, damn, I hope he's not nasty looking because everything sounds so great. His falsetto is terrific. It's vulnerable, yet it's real, on the vocals. And, I wanted to hug who was ever singing on there, but I kept thinking, I hope he's not nasty looking because, that would just be really awful. You got this, almost every ingredient. A little development is necessary here, but you've got every ingredient. And when he came over, obviously we know Prince is not a really tall person. Somehow that just doesn't matter. But when he came over and I saw him, the first thing I noticed was, I had an internal sigh of relief because, he's cute. He's a good-looking dude. But the second thing that struck me, besides his looks and was his focus. And then eventually, over the course of that afternoon, I could tell that this was someone of very high intellect. And I wrote about it, and I wrote about it in my book. That's what struck me the most, probably was his focus. There was an intensity, and there was an intellect. I was throwing out just, trying to make friends and throwing out maybe some marketing possibilities that we could do with him. I didn't have a management contract at the time, but he was picking up on that, not missing a beat. He was absorbing everything. And he was a man of very, very few words. Once we got to know each other, it was just like any other relationship where you're having conversation. But, Prince, he was a shy guy. And, if he didn't really know you, he didn't feel that comfortable. So he always just had very few words. And so, but when I met him and I saw all this in one package and a man of few words, it was kind of like, there's kind of a mystique about him. And if I do get the opportunity to manage him, this natural built-in mystique that he has, that's the type of thing that people use to, this is not a bad word, it's a good word, to exploit that artist. So my thinking was that he's so talented, his voice is so unbelievable, that if we can do, we have to redo the demo tape. And I brought in David Rifkin, David Z at the time, who was recording other acts. David and I had been in bands together early on. David had perfect pitch, and he'd become a recording engineer. And what he was doing was great at the time. He was recording a lot of the bands from the Twin Cities. So I remember asking David and saying, hey, I got this kid. You want to hear it? David heard the demo. He knew exactly what to do with it. So I raised some money, and we put Prince in the studio to make his demo tape that we would present to the labels. And David and Prince worked, very hard. I got a management contract together with Prince. There was a few bumpy points along the way, but we got it done. And it's all in the book, how that works. And we were on our way. But I figured, and going back to the man of a few words, kind of a mystery about him, my tact for presenting him to the record labels to see if we could get a record deal was to have a press kit that said nothing on it. It just was his name. Because I wanted it to be the same feeling as when I heard that tape for the first time. I had no idea who this guy was. So the press kit cost us $100 a piece to put together. And it cost us $100 a piece to put together. We only made 15 of them. But they said nothing. It was just a picture of him on each page with a tiny little quote about the instrument that he played and nothing else. Because I figured that he is so talented that we had the right demo tape put together now with David that let his music do the talking. Because that's the purest form of what he's doing, of what he is. And I also knew that once we went to the record labels and flew out to Los Angeles, I also knew that if the A&R person at the record label, the job it is to scout out potential signings for the record label, that A&R people usually have the attention span of a small fly. And so you better hit them over the head pretty hard if you're going to play them music when you go into their offices in Los Angeles. But I knew that they would be attracted by the music. And then we had this press kit that said nothing. So if the A&R person heard it at the record label, they would invariably, because nothing was being said about who this kid was other than his name, nothing was being said about him, so they would start asking me questions. And if they started asking me questions, I owned them because I knew that they were intrigued and they were interested. And that's exactly what happened. So exactly what happened was we got them all curious about this kid. I again, used my expertise of lying to get into the record labels, something that I had developed into a fine craft by that point. And one of the ways I did it, again, nobody gets hurt. I knew that the business moved on jealousy and of something that could be great. So I did know the people at Warner Brothers beforehand because I had done some work for them at Warner Brothers Records. So I called them up over at Warner's and I said, Columbia Records is flying us out because there's this young genius and he's got this great stuff and they're flying us out and putting us up at the hotel. While we're here for Columbia Records, would you at Warner Brothers want to hear his tape as well, his demo tape? And they were like, sure. Somebody else, Columbia's flying them out? Yeah, sure. We want to hear who this is. And so I made an appointment. Then I hung up from them and I called Columbia Records and I said, listen, Warner Brothers has this big meeting set up for this 18-year-old genius. And while we're out here meeting with them, would you like to? Oh, sure. Warner Brothers. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. So jealousy, when you're trying to introduce something, makes everything, and it's a white lie. Then when I had both of them on the line, I called A&M Records, which was a huge record label at that time, Joe Cocker, Peter Frampton, on and on. And I called them and I said, I'm making a major presentation to Columbia Records and Warner Brothers Records. Would you want to hear this? And, oh, sure, we'll give you an appointment, blah, blah, blah. So effective lying. Nobody gets hurt. Not evil, because somebody's going to win. Sure. And eventually Warner Brothers did win the contract. They came to the table with Three Records firm, which is, the whole time, I hope nobody else is listening from the other labels, I really wanted Warner Brothers to sign Prince because they were an artist development company. But I had to get a bidding war going in order to get 3 albums firm. So all in all, it turned out that we made probably it was the largest record deal in history for a young, unproven artist. And that would have been 1977. It's a long time ago now that we signed him, and it was the biggest signing in history. But we put together everything very well for him, and really it's as much about Prince's talent, obviously, as anything else, sure, because he was amazingly talented. And the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, it's an incredible story how it worked out. And, it was kind of a slow build for Prince, to become a megastar. It seems like that probably wouldn't be the case nowadays since the music business kind of just, if you don't have it immediately, then they kind of move on to the next thing, it seems.
Well, that's it exactly. And it's one of the things that I rail against in my class is there's not a high degree of believability at the record labels, and there's not a large degree, from what I can see, standing, far away from the labels now, that there's really no sort of development at the record labels. Look, the ink wasn't dry yet on Prince's contract at Warner Brothers when Prince told me, I don't want anybody to produce me but me. So ink isn't dry, and I'm flying back out to L.A. to tell the chairman and the president of the company that Prince wants to produce himself, and he's never made an album before. And we did a few tests to see if he could do it. It's in the book. But at the end of the day, they said, okay, we'll let him do it. That would never happen today. It just wouldn't happen. I mean, it might happen on the independent record label side where people are producing their own stuff, at home or on Pro Tools or Avid or whatever they do. But back in that day, that was unheard of. And I think the labels have gotten hurt because of the lack of true development and so much of it being left. Nowadays it seems like before they'll sign you, you have to have a following. And you have to, be playing in clubs and put out some stuff on social media, which is all well and good. But what about standing by an artist? These days, if you sell 100,000 units, which would have been great in the past as an opening album, they make a decision, probably going to drop you. So even in my class, I often talk with my, the students about because they're all young and they're in the business. They want to either work at record labels, or they are artists, or they're artist managers. And I talk to them about what's lacking today. And I think there's also a lack of big, long-lasting superstars, if you may, today comparatively. You know, one of the biggest recurrent albums that's played on the radio is Pink Floyd. These are, and the Stones and these are long-lasting artists. Prince will be one of those. And, you know, for the gift that he was able to give us. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I've fallen out, but my students keep me pretty well educated as to what's going on. And it doesn't have the same feel. I don't know if you're seeing that because you're at a station, you're playing music. I don't know if you see that as well, or if you agree or disagree with that.
No, it's definitely, you know, every year it's the same, you know, bulk of stuff from the, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s. It kind of just keeps going regardless of how much time passes.
It recycles. And I see a lot of groups these days, and I like kind of what they do. But there are groups that are flavor of the month groups. There are acts that are that come along every couple of years. There's some acts that come along every 10 years. I put Prince in that category of artists that come along probably every 50 years. And I put the Dylans in there, Miles Davis. I put, John Lennon, that are true gifted songwriters. And I think there are people who are poised to do that. And by the way, it doesn't make a difference whether it's hip-hop, rap or hip-hop or what's country music. It doesn't make a difference. It's just, once something comes into the common culture of music like rap and hip-hop are, I want to see artists that people are going to be reflecting on 50 years from now. I mean, it's been 42 years or 41 years since I signed Prince. And look at people, he's on the lips of everybody even today. And I'm wondering what artist that's sitting around today is going to be on the lips of people 50 years from now. Is that going to be possible? And so it's, I'm seeing a lot of, one of the advantages that we had back in my day when I'll go back to my band now in 1902. I used to say back in the days of horse-drawn radio. But in the 60s, radio stations would play your single if you brought it out there. And that's what I did. We borrowed $500 from our lead singer's uncle. And we cut a record and then brought it out to the station. I believe it was WDGY back in Minneapolis. And it was like 20 below zero, and I trudged out through the snow up to the station's door, knocked on the door, and handed the DJ the record. He invited me in because it was freezing. And in between the records that he was spinning, he listened to what we had, and he said, yeah, maybe I'll give that thing a spin. So I left. I get in my car, freezing, driving back to my apartment or wherever I was at the time. Well, no, it would have been my parents' house back then. And he was going to give it a spin. But I had all these girls from my class lined up. And I said, if they should play the record, this was like at 10 o'clock at night, if they should play the record, call in and request it. and then hang up, change your voice, call back and request it. And, and what happened was he played the record on my drive home. I listened to it. I heard our record, Turn On Your Love Light, by the High Spirits. And I heard it on the radio. And then he comes back on and he says, whoa, our phone line's lit up. So we might have a hit here. So I had put that together. So going back to present day, so a lot of my students will say, well, it wasn't like that because radio is very tightly controlled these days. They're controlled by conglomerates who tell massive amounts of stations what to play. That hope of bringing your little disc out to a station and they'll give it a spin like in the movies, that's over. Except probably for more independent radio stations and smaller radio stations that have more leeway. But so my students are saying, God, we wish it was like the old days. And I'm saying, no, you don't. Because we didn't have the advantage in the 60s of social media. getting a buzz going, either on a Facebook fan page or on Instagram, or even coming up with some sort of Twitter campaign to come out with, or YouTube and all of that. So you do have that availability that we didn't have. My instincts from seeing the world of music cycle around so many times in a row is usually when the record labels start getting into the, we want one of those. So if somebody's got a major artist on a record label, the other record label, Bruno Mars is probably the closest incarnation to great music, songwriting. People may or may not like Bruno Mars, but listen, the dude is very successful. And he's probably the closest incarnation of the old days where you had artists making great music. They can get on stage, dance their ass off. They do give a great show, and they're extremely talented and driven. By the way, do you know how Bruno Mars started out?
No, I don't think so.
He grew up in Hawaii, but when he was 4 years old, he was known as the youngest Elvis Presley impersonator in the world. And if you go on YouTube, there's actual videos of a little Bruno Mars being Elvis Presley in a little Elvis suit and all that kind of stuff. It's crazy. But he's probably the closest incarnation to a songwriter, really, great performer, pulling out all the stops. I know there's other people, there's always the exception. But I tend to find that when music gets into a stalemate where it's not the labels are not giving us the major artists, that it sort of emanates from the indie record label sides of things. You see a lot of independent record labels rise up. And the indie labels, they sort of rise up and they give birth to, because they can be experimental with artists without having too much of a consequence. Experimenting with artists is another area that the labels just don't want to engage in at this point. So you'll see it coming from the indie area. And then hopefully we'll see some long-lasting, gifted group or artist come along. So that was a long-winded response. You can do with that as you may. That's kind of my theory.
Excellent. Well, Owen, I know the book, Famous People Who Have Met Me, just out. Is there maybe something else coming up or something else in the works?
Well, there's a couple of other things that I'm involved with. I'm going to be on a little bit of a book tour. I'm trying to get back into the Midwest to do more of the book tour, right now. There's a lot of stories that I didn't put in the first book. Famous People Who've Met Me, a memoir by the man who discovered Prince. See, I can be a shameless promoter, too. And it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Apple Books. So, but there are a lot of stories that I didn't feel like putting in the first go-around on the book. So we've had some real good success. We hit #1 in category on Hot New Sellers on Amazon, a couple of weeks ago, and we'll continue that. And I'm going to go to San Francisco and do some things in Louisville, Kentucky, and I want to get back into Minneapolis, and I'm doing 3 book presentations here in Los Angeles. So stay tuned. There might be the second part of my career, which has been a long time. So here we go.
Awesome.
So that's pretty much it. So I appreciate it.
No, I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you again when the next book comes out. I hope we can set something up. Yeah,
good. And I'm glad you like the book, and it's an interesting read, and it's Minnesota-based, and I have a lot of love for that area of the country, and so many things that have emanated from Minnesota, especially musically. It's an island. The whole state is an island of the North, and Minnesota has contributed a lot of things to the arts and in every other which way. So very respectful of the area. So we'll talk to you soon, and I appreciate it.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much, and I love the book, and I want to talk to you again when the next one comes out.
You got it. Thank you, Brian.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.